Welcome, Grimdark Collective. I hope you're all doing well. Prepare yourselves, for today you'll follow me down the rabbit hole into my obsession with all things dark, macabre, horrific and terrifying. I'll show you my methodology, approach and vision of painting the brutal and unforgettable Lord of Tumours from Trench Crusade. I'll cover some both familiar and lesser known techniques I employed to bring this impressive sculpt to life, including the oil scrubbing technique, the use of varnishes to alter surface tension, and multiple ways of achieving mottling and surface finish variation. So, let us partake in communion. I'm Black Chalice Studio, and you are about to enter the trenches. The Lord of Tumours is a crazy sculpt, brimming with detail, multiple opportunities to add varied finishes, and lots of room to use some of our favourite effects to their potential. I built up a small scenic base for the Lord, starting with some cork sheet to add a touch of elevation. I created some pikes out of trimmed down toothpicks, impaled some skulls by drilling holes through them, covered the rest of the base in my favourite basing mix, and made sure to leave space at the rear for his two followers. My only change to the Lord is some subtle alteration to the fabric of his robes. In order to achieve this, I took some liquid green stuff and diluted it with water. When thinned, this mix can be brushed on and dries pretty rapidly. I prefer this technique over the Tamiya putty one for more natural surfaces like cloth and bone. My first application is one thin, even layer put down using an old brush. The liquid green stuff goes on really smoothly, and it's also great for filling small holes and gaps in your miniatures. When applying this second layer, I'll load my brush fairly heavily and use long, downward, vertical strokes, following the volume of the robes. I'll repeat these downward strokes a few times. What this will do is leave minute lines in the putty, helping give a very subtle texture to the smooth, plain resin underneath. It may not look like much now, but this will show up nicely later on in the painting stages. And with that step taken care of, this is how we're looking so far, ready for paint. After priming the miniature with our trusty Steinalways Black, I came in for the base coat on the flesh, making up a mix of 2:1 GW Deepkin flesh and Karak stone. I built this up over several thin coats through an airbrush at 25 psi. This will give us a fairly pale, sickly looking foundation for our skin with a hint of brown. Our primary highlight for the skin is going to be straight Deepkin flesh. This is applied over several thin layers in a zenithal manner, gradually building up the opacity, leaving some of that brownish tone on the undersides of the masses of flesh. For the final highlight here, I added a touch of white ink to the Deepkin flesh. I focused a few thin passes over the highest points in areas that I wanted to draw attention, such as the tops of his shoulders and the tumours on his back. To wrap up our airbrush work for today, I came in with a subtle acrylic filter of Caribou Crimson to any areas of open flesh, some of the deeper crevices on the skin, and areas I wanted to imply inflammation and bruising. I dropped my pressure to around 15 psi for this and went in very sparingly. The next step in bringing about that sickly, diseased and gnarly flesh I'm looking for is our unifying wash. This will not only give us some shading, but it will tint the underlying colours as well. My selection was Villainy Ink Dystopian Brown, diluted slightly with spirits to help it flow, and applied in an even, controlled layer by brush. I'll come in with a second pass on a few of the deeper crevices, just to reinforce the saturation and the shading effect as well. By coming in with a blow dryer on medium heat for around 30 seconds, we can flash off the solvents in the unifying wash. After this, I left the miniature to dry for half an hour before coming back. For the reductive pass, I opted for a Q-tip, lightly loaded with spirit. My intention here was to create smooth gradients between the crevices and larger, more open areas of skin. With this in mind, I went with more of a swiping motion with the Q-tip, concentrating on cleaning off the raised areas, leaving the wash quite pronounced in the crevices. After my initial reductive pass, I went in with a more focused one, using a Q-tip where the tip has been twisted into a finer point. I use this to really smooth out the points of transition around the shaded areas and deep recesses, reactivating and feathering out any hard edges where the wash has dried. The smoother we can get these areas, the better the skin will look under all of the following layers and effects we will add later on. For the first of many stages of mottling today, we're going to come in with the spattering technique. Firstly with Carroburg Crimson, then with Colia Green shade, combining warm and cool tones equally. I'll load up an old brush with neat paint, then use a toothpick to flick the bristles towards a miniature, creating micro spatters of varying sizes. Exercise some restraint here, we want the spattering to be subtle rather than overpowering. In order to refine any spatter marks that aren't to our liking, or are placed in areas that we don't want them, we can come in with a soft, fine tip brush and some isopropyl alcohol. Be as gentle as you can here. Isopropyl is a strong solvent and can quite easily eat through underlying areas of paint if you're too heavy-handed. We can alter the shapes of our spatter marks here and even remove them if needs be. I'm now going to show you a method of altering the surface tension of the miniature in order to create some interesting effects using enamels in the following steps. Enamels and oils have a tendency to stain dead matte acrylics when applied over top of them, making certain techniques quite difficult to achieve easily. By applying a couple of thin coats of satin varnish here, we will lay down a much smoother and less porous layer over which to apply our enamels. For this example, I'm using Green Stuff World Acrylic Satin Varnish. After giving our varnish layers roughly an hour to cure, we're firstly going to come in with a fine tip liner brush lightly loaded with Carrion Crimson. I'll then begin to slowly and carefully paint on some fine lines to represent veins. These will eventually be covered by a few consecutive layers of translucent effects, but they will still be visible and look like they are buried just beneath the surface of the skin. The aim here is to get these veins looking subtle and natural, so the finer the lines, the better. If in doubt, take a look at some pictures of hypervascularity for reference to see how they should be scaled and laid out. If we were applying these veins over a dead matte surface, they would tend to go down a little rough and spread once applied, whereas over our satin layers it's really easy to get natural and fine lines. With the carrion veins applied to our liking, we'll come in and repeat the process with Colia Green, complementing the warmer tone of the previous step with a cooler one here. You will see here that I've applied the other base coats over a foundation of Abaddon Black. For the armour, I've used a 1-to-1 mix of Scale 75 Necro Gold and Vallejo Metal Colour Gold, and for the robes, I've used a 2-to-1 mix of Abaddon Black and Vallejo Tire Black. I've also painted the areas of open wounds with Rakarth Flesh. Here I've come in for the second usage of satin varnish. First of all, to once again provide a smoother layer for our next enamel effect, and also as a way of sealing in the veins we've applied. This way, any enamel usage over top won't interact with or reactivate them. Our next step towards bringing about some truly sickly and gnarly flesh is going to be using a particulated filter in the crevices to add shading, contrast and some mottling. I've opted for a 2-to-1 mix of Goon's Grime and Decrepit Filth. I come in with a lightly loaded brush and glaze this into the deepest recesses on the flesh, any areas where the skin meets the armour, and places I wanted the most prominent shading. Decrepit Filth is a muddy, blackish brown hue with lots of particulation, and my aim here is to steer these particles into the folds and recesses of the skin, keeping them away from the open expanses of flesh. Because we were precise in the placement of this glazing step, there's only minimal cleanup required, just softening off a few areas of transition with the Q-tip dampened with spirits. The final step for this stage is to come in with a brush dampened with spirits and carefully pick up and move around any particles that may be left behind, steering and pushing these into the crevices, giving those areas the look that they are filled with nasty, pustulant deposits. Now we can take a look at one of my favourite methods of rendering subtle colour variations and mottling to areas of skin. This technique is known by either the oil dot filtering or scrubbing technique. To start with, I'll place a small amount of neat oil on a non-absorbent palette material. Here I'm using Abtalung olive green for the diseased, putrid areas of skin and tumours, and coagulated blood for the open wounds and deep sores littering the Lord's shoulders and back. To begin with, we're going to apply some tiny dots of the neat oil to the area we want the coloration. Oils are very highly saturated, so we're going to work with very small amounts at a time and build up the intensity through repeat application. With our dots of oil placed, I come in with a soft, clean and dry brush. I personally prefer a shorter bristled one, and begin to scrub or feather the oil into the surrounding areas. One of the many benefits of oils is how smoothly they apply in comparison to acrylics, allowing us to achieve super smooth and subtle blends and transitions. Let's take a look at the application method in its entirety once more here. Apply the small dots of oil to the chosen area, swap out to our feathering brush to scrub the oils on, creating smooth variation and mottling. The olive green is perfect for representing nasty, poxed flesh, festering with God only knows what kind of diseases. If we come in with a Q-tip ever so slightly dampened with spirits, we can feather the filter away from the raised pustules here, revealing the sickly, pale flesh colour underneath. We can also feather very gently any transitions where we applied the filter, refining them to our taste and creating a seamless gradient. Moving on to the coagulated blood, I'll filter this on to the large holes in his tumours, open wounds, and anywhere I want to imply inflammation or bruising, such as around his elbows, his wrists, a little on his fingers, and areas where his armour meets the skin. This dark, bloody crimson colour is perfect for these purposes. Here you can see the effect that repeat applications can have. With each successive layer, the saturation, intensity and vibrancy will increase, and the layers will blend together seamlessly. The applications for this technique are super wide ranging, so give it a go and have some fun experimenting. Okay, let's move over to the armour for now. With the flesh being the main focus of the Lord, I wanted to keep the other areas fairly subdued. My aim for the armour was to give it the look of an ancient, tarnished and worn metal, almost like gold, with a heavy patina to add some surface finish variation by way of a dry, matte look. I chose a 1-to-1 mix of goon's grime and decrepit filth for the unifying wash for both the armour and robes. Applied as a fairly generous wash on the armour, more of a controlled and slightly thin filter on the robes. I came in with a second pass with more decrepit filth added for the lower portion of the robes, closer to where they meet the ground, as this area would generally see a heavier build-up of grime and dirt. For the reductive pass on the armour, I waited half an hour or so for the enamel wash to take a good hold, gently reactivated and removed the wash very lightly from the raised details, leaving the majority of the plates quite dark and dingy. And with the robes, I gently feathered the unifying wash away from the raised folds using a Q-tip moderately loaded with spirits, leaving the recessed areas with quite a pronounced dirty, grimy look. Now we can start getting really nasty with the Lord's flesh, starting off with our foundation layer of the gore effect. Taking some neat carrying crimson, I applied this fairly liberally to all of the open wounds, holes in his tumours, around his maw hidden under the front of his helmet, and also around the skin where it meets the armour. With our first layer down, I came in with the second pass in the deeper wounds and holes to intensify the saturation and high gloss look. I also took the time to create some very fine and subtle streaks to imply blood seeping from the wounds and running down his flesh, in particular from his mouth. Once again, because we've been very controlled in our gore application, there's minimal cleanup required, just feathering out a few transitions using a Q-tip and a little bit of spirits. In the same way we controlled and manipulated the particles in our shading wash earlier, we'll do the same here with the carrying crimson pigments. Using a slightly dampened brush, I'll pick up any of the particles that have made their way out onto the open expanses of skin and deposit them back in the wounds, sores and holes. To reinforce that bloody and gory look even further, I'm going to show you one of my favourite methods. As you can see here, the carrying crimson I was using earlier has begun to cure and turn into a thick, sticky and heavily particulated gel. We can reactivate this using a small amount of spirits, and this makes for excellent chunky, coagulated blood. I'll pick up small chunks of this mix and place it very deliberately into the deepest wounds and areas of broken skin. The colour, physical texture and high gloss finish of this is great for adding mottling and surface finish variation to these areas. I also glazed a couple of layers of this mix over the areas I base coated in Rakarth flesh earlier, giving them a look of exposed muscle. And to take care of the strings of gore coming out of his tumours, I came in with a neat mix of 1-to-1 carrying crimson and Ichor the Damned, applied in 2 generous layers. Using this same mix, I added a few trails to the areas under and around the gore streaks. I was quite sparing with these applications, putting just a couple down to add some visual interest. For any of the streaks that need refining, we can come in with a fine brush and a small amount of spirits and feather at the edges to modulate them to taste. After applying the previous step, I took a look at the progress so far and decided I needed to complement the warmer tones we've just reinforced with a cooler one. Back to the oil scrubbing technique again then, this time with Abtalung Midnight Blue. This deep, cold and rich indigo colour will make for some really effective areas of necrotic flesh, so I apply it to a select few places, like the elbows, the mutated hand and in a few small areas across his shoulders and back. Let's move over to the armour again for a while. With the dark and dingy foundation laid down, it's time to add some patina and effects to bring it in line with the horrific vision I had in mind for this guy. Using equal parts Abtalung Smoke, Oxide Blue Patina and Turquoise Lights, I gave the armour a thinned wash to introduce some colour. This was then followed up by a quick and light reductive pass. To further enhance the colour and visual interest here, I added some more turquoise and washed this mix around the most prominent details. The armour is still looking nice and subdued as planned, but it's starting to become more interesting with each step. Again, a very light reductive pass is made and we can move on. Just to tie everything together so far and darken the armour down just a tad, I came in with a glaze of Nuln Oil. By using an acrylic glaze for this over an enamel, we won't reactivate or remove any of the previous steps we've just done. In order to pop some subtle contrast on the armour, we're going to apply a very sparing highlight, using the base gold mix and a lightly loaded dry brushing technique. We're only looking to pick out the extreme raised parts here, hinting at the metallic shine buried underneath the patina and oxide. As another step in achieving a realistic look and more visual interest, I came in with carrying crimson here and applied a few small patches to the edge of any armour plates that meet the flesh, pushing the idea that the Lord has grown and mutated over time, his armour becoming embedded into his very skin. One of the final steps in our armour work up here is the addition of some Decay of Death. Thinned 1-to-1 with spirits, I'll glaze this on in small areas, blow drying each pass before moving in for another. This way we can gauge just how strong the effect is looking. The dead matte, chalky finish of this Decay will be a really nice contrast in surface finish against the satin skin and high gloss gore. A quick refining pass with a brush and some spirits, and we're all done with this step. And I'll come in with one final pass of carrying crimson again, just to reinforce the areas where the armour is submerged into the skin, leaving a slick, bloody mess in place. We're moving into the final stages now, so it's time to tackle the robes. Our first step is to lightly glaze some of the base colour onto the raised folds, to pop some subtle highlights and add a small amount of contrast. Following this, I'll take some straight tire black, thin to a glaze again, and apply this to the highest points on the folds, keeping everything quite low key and faint. After waiting for the acrylics to dry for half hour or so, the penultimate step is a heavily diluted filter of 2:1 Goon's Grime and Decrepit Filth, just to tie everything together so far. The last detail we need to address before finishing the skin is the Lord's horns. My plan for these was to have the look of charred, blackened and ancient steel, so over the base coat of black I stippled on some neat dirty down in thick patches. Over top of this I stippled on some slightly thin dirty down, adding more orange hue on top of the oily, dirty, dark brownish red from the previous step. And last up, we come in with a very light dry brush of lead belcher, picking out the raised edges and giving a slight metallic sheen. And that's it. 3 easy steps for a fairly simple, yet striking and subtle result. Sometimes we don't need to obsess over the smallest details too much, and just see them as part of the larger overall picture. As a final effect for the robes, and to tie the Lord into his base a bit, we're going to apply a couple of passes of Decay of Death, heavily thinned as a glaze. The effect won't be super strong, but will add yet another layer of visual interest to the miniature. It's now time to really push that nasty, diseased and disgusting skin to the final level. Coming in with satin varnish once again, I'll glaze on one layer, slightly thinned, to the entirety of the skin, to give it a sickly, slick sheen, as if the very pores are weeping a thin film of ichor. This, along with the next and final step, will really push our surface finish variation to the limit. And to complete today's tutorial, we're going to come in with gloss varnish. This is applied slightly thin to all of the sores, open wounds, holes in the tumours, gore trails and areas of blood. After the first pass, I'll come in with a second, undiluted one, just to really push the effect in the larger holes and wounds, giving the impression of fresh gore barely being contained by the Lord's body. And here is the Lord of Tumours in all his macabre, horrifying and grimdark glory. I'd just like to take a second to thank you all for watching. Your support and encouragement makes my black heart swell. My aim is to continue showing you my vision of painting and modelling in the grimdark style, with an always present tinge of horror and the macabre. If you have any suggestions for what you'd like to see in the future, please feel free to let me know in the comments. So for now, I bid you a good week, keep it grim, and I'll see you next time.